Week 1 of Archazias Islands has came, it's seen, we saw it, we got stuff to break down about it. There were 3 tournaments all over the globe consisting of 44 players or more. Battle Bear, 44 players. Encounter Comics and Games, 51 players. And Southside Gaming, 138 players. We got the top 16 from Southside. We got the top 8 from Encounter and Battle Bear. Let's get into those right now. The Week 1 meta breakdown. As we have described for you, there are lots to look at here and kind of understand and break down. Ruby Sapphire Control, as expected, was the most successful top 8 and or top 16 deck. This is the top 8 of the Encounter and Battle Bear and top 16 of Southside Gaming. 6 Sapphire Steel aggro decks, 5 Sapphire Steel item decks, 4 Amethyst Steel aggro decks, 2 Amber Steel aggro decks, 2 Ruby Sapphire item decks, 1 of the following Amber Emerald, Amethyst Ruby, Amethyst Steel Midrange, Emerald Steel Discard, and Sapphire Amethyst Midrange. So a pretty well variety of things here. As we can showcase, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different decks being represented in the top 16 and or better from these first weekend of events, which is nice to see. There is a very large portion of Sapphire decks, of course, here. You can see there's 13, 18, 20, 21 Sapphire decks. So that's definitely taking up a large portion of the metagame. But it's as to be expected. Sapphire got the best cards, the most exciting cards. Most players are looking to get into them and play those characters. And we're going to see the differences of some of these decks and why some were favored more than others. But Ruby Sapphire Control in Week 1, showcasing that Sapphire Coil is one of the more dominant cards to get you into a top 8. The winning decks were all Sapphire Steel, however. So while Ruby Sapphire was the most consistent in getting the top 8, Sapphire Steel won all 3 tournaments. The Sapphire Steel aggro deck won the Battle Bear tournament, and then 2 Sapphire Steel item decks consisted of winning both SSG and the Encounter. 138 players, 51 players, each dominated by Sapphire Steel items, pretty much going undefeated the entire day, and only real losses in those tournaments were against one another. Huge thing to be kind of debated and talked about. I actually did a whole podcast on that yesterday, so if you want to hear more about my thoughts on that, go check out that podcast. But in all honesty, this looks healthy, and it does look interesting, and it looks like we have a lot of choice and diversity. Whether or not that's true probably remains up to be debated, only because of the dominance that Sapphire Steel showcased in Week 1, the same 60-card deck, winning and top 4ing 4 of the top 8 spots, or 4 of the spots from 2 different events in top 4, and 2 wins, all by the exact same 60 cards, which was the deck that was created by Zan Syed and Jeremy that were showcased on the Metafy. So dominant showcasing early. Let's see what happens with it moving forward. As a little idea here, this is what the breakdown of top cuts look like, and we have the data real quick just to showcase again that this was the most played decks in the Encounter tournament. So Ruby Sapphire, Sapphire Steel, and Amethyst Steel were, the most played decks. So it's not too shocking here that they were also the best converted decks in these tournaments. Just wanted to touch on that real quick. But while we're at it, let's break down some of these decks, guys. Hey guys, wanted to quickly interrupt and remind you that the ultimate guide for Archazias Island is on sale now. This full guide encompasses every version of Archazias Island that is important. It has a limited guide. It has finance options, finance guides, the pre-sale bundle concept of saying what you should have went and got early on, which guess what, guys? We said Tamatoas, we said Scrooges. Those were cards that you probably should have attacked. If you didn't, you did miss out. For anyone that did read that and did get those cards, they definitely are benefiting now. We also are going to be adding in a diary of TFM, tournament reports, thoughts, different videos, kind of showcasing what our opinions are of the current metagame from a week-to-week basis. This guide will be updated at least once per week, but I'm hoping that it's more than that. It is the best way to support the channel. So if you love TFM and you want to support us, this is the best way. It's through Metafy. Go check it out in the pinned comments below. Ruby Sapphire Control was the #1 deck to hit the most consistent top 8s and top 16s this past weekend. The best one on the weekend was Mark Miller, who finished in top 4 of the SSG 138-player 10-case tournament. You can see here, this is a Sapphire Coil deck through and through. We have 6 Sisus between the human and the Floodborn. We still have sharks, we got brawls, we have a little bit of everything. We did remove the control the castle concept by not playing any McDucks matters and in favor of just only playing 2 sharks. But really what this deck is representing is an insane amount of way to truly break the game on turn 4, whether it be Popsicles returning and playing a crab very early on, whether it be playing a turn 4 Maui Shark, which then enables really fundamental disadvantages for your opponent's aggro concepts. I believe that this is a trick of all trades version of the Ruby Sapphire. I think it's a very content version. It gives you the most options as a player to kind of dictate your way through a matchup. I think Mark Miller had a great run this past weekend, losing in the top 4 in a mirror match to the item version that we're going to be discussing in a little bit later. Sapphire Coil came out to play this weekend. It's going to be one of the more dominant cards in the metagame, more than likely, and it has showcased that right up front, the card has a lot of potential and will continue to be dominant until further notice. Sapphire Steel picked up a win for the aggro version at Battle Bear. This was also 6 of the potential top 8 decks that we had seen. Sapphire Steel was always going to be a dominant deck week 1. There was just too many new cards, Bell included, that really kind of made this deck very, very interesting and very, very powerful. But the aggro versions were the most consistent, and this did pick up a win in an aggro mirror finals at Battle Bear. You can see here this Alice Doc version is definitely a play on the Harlan Sweetie Sapphire Steel build that he has been working on for quite some time, understanding and respecting what Benja can do. And then, of course, one of my favorite characters from set 6, John Silver. I think John Silver is a card that we'd only seen here and there in Amber Steel packages, every once in a while in Amethyst Steel packages. It's nice to see this character coming back in and being successful in Sapphire Steel as well. Being able to protect cards like Alice and Hiram is very, very powerful, and definitely being able to set up certain lines with early aggression and Smee. Having your Smee survive an extra 2 turns is huge by not taking any damage and by not being able to be challenged. I think this deck is a very, very nice addition to the metagame. I think on the play, it is very difficult to compete with, and it has very strong endgame lines with Alice and even a card as simple as Gantu. But having cards like John Silver and Pluto really, really do affect the game state. And of course, Pete Games Referee is going to be pretty dominant in the metagame moving forward regardless. The question will become, is Sapphire Steel aggro good enough and or better than its counterpart Sapphire Steel items? Jeremy picked up the first place victory at Southside Gaming this past weekend in the 138 player tournament with none other than this Oswald deck. It's a deck that I've talked about a bunch over the last few days. I covered it at length in the encounter video on Monday. I discussed it on the podcast yesterday. This is a deck that has been the talk of the town on many different channels, on socials, and everywhere else. What does this deck do better than anything else? Well, it plays the most cards for free. Oswald lets you play cards for free. Bell gets played for free. Scrooge gets played for free. Tamatoa gets you cards back and lets you play them for free. All the more while having the addition of playing cards like Let the Storm Rage On, Strength of a Raging Fire, and Along Came Zeus that can be sung for free by the characters that you played for free. That's right, guys. The whole point of this deck is if it's free, it's for me. It's very, very simple to say that this deck just does so many things that are unfair and kind of breaking the dynamics of the serve of the I play a pawn, you play a pawn concept of you might play 3 pawns and 3 pawns is like a knight or a bishop. So if all of your opponents are just going play my ink return, play a character, and you're like, yeah, that's cool. I'm going to ink return, reveal the top card of my deck, put an item into play an item, exert it, put another ink into play, reveal the top card of my deck, put an item into play, exert my items, put a Scrooge into play, go find a card, great, cool. All right, your turn. Well, on my turn, I did wave. Oh, I forgot something. Am I a Bell here? Oh, she's going to exert and sing this song for free also. So while you did one thing, I did 6 things. And I think that that's exactly what this deck does. If you have not seen video content of this yet, description below has the stream link that we streamed. Rounds 6, top 8, and the finals are all great showcases of how really, truthfully powerful this deck is. Huge shout out to Zan and Jeremy for, figuring this one out and giving the ability to share it with everyone else through their Metafy. If you're really looking for all of the complete information on this, go check out Zan's Metafy. It covers everything pretty well, and I'm sure he'll be updating as it goes on. But if you're also looking for our point of view from it, we're going to be covering it in a video with myself, David Nunez, and some of his takes on the deck, because he also finished in a top 4, losing to it in a mirror match in top 4. So deck's really good, guys. It's probably the new boogeyman in the format. I made a joke last week about Ruby Sapphire being the boogeyman. This is officially the boogeyman. Just saying. Amethyst Seal Aggro was our next most successful deck on the weekend, and this is the top 4 version of that deck from the 44-player tournament at Battle Bear. Pretty straightforward. We picked up none other than Giant Cobra, and that's it. This version is deciding to go with Strength of a Raging Fire, and then along came Zeus, along with 3 libraries. I do think that I heard a lot of conversation over the past weekend about, Amethyst Steel decks that cut library, and then we're losing to Ruby Sapphire. Guys, those two things, they go together. Don't cut libraries from your deck. They're the reason you can beat Ruby Sapphire. They create the lines that let you continue in the match unless your opponent has very specific answers like Hideaway, like Cusco. When they don't have those things, you're able to kind of really nudge out the game by drawing additional cards and keeping threat on the board. It's very, and I do mean this, it's very similar to Ruby Amethyst of the past, Ruby Sapphire, when all we were doing was playing Chernobyls, Brooms, Cuscos, Maleficents. All we were doing is ever just playing a cooking card to play and drawing a card. Rabbit, Castle. Like, our way to compete against the Be Prepared was just always putting in low threat level characters that replace themselves. Library means all of your characters become that. You need that card in order to get through the Ruby Sapphire mess. You need that card to answer the brawls, the Sisus, the Sapphire Coil shenanigans. Like, without library, you're never going to win. It's like, you need that card, period. So if you're the type of player that took library out of your deck because you don't understand it, you're wrong. Go put it back in your deck. It's the only way you're going to beat Ruby Sapphire consistently. I promise you this. This gets covered in the guide that we have on the Metafy. Amethyst Steel, it's my jam. It's like literally what I understand, I think, the best in Disney Lorcana. Library is the key. Stop taking it out of your decks. Honestly, just stop. But for the rest of this deck, really straightforward, really good. I think, it didn't need much. We said going in that Amethyst Steel didn't get anything crazy, but it did get one of the more powerful cards in the set, which is Giant Cobra. So having it see success in this fashion early on, not shocking at all. Will it still be able to contend in a metagame where Sapphire Steel items is dominant? That's going to be the debate. What are we going to have to do to kind of compete with those things? Are we going to have to figure out a way to go a little bit faster? Do we have to maybe put a little more willpower in my deck? These are the questions that I would start asking if it's possible. And if it is possible, how do we do that? And how do we kind of like navigate towards that the next several weeks? Amber Steel Aggro picked up a 2nd place finish at the Encounter 51-player tournament. Me is a member of the TFM community. He is a Metafy supporter, and he was able to get there on day 1 with a deck with actually 0 cards from Archazias Island. I think this is important. I think it's really notable to say that, hey, I didn't need to go out and buy Tamatoas and buy Scrooges. I didn't need to go out and do those things week 1. I could show up to my tournament, be successful, and win product. Me ended up finishing in 2nd place, picking up nearly a case of product for his victory, or for his finalist runner-up, I should say. But nonetheless, he played wonderful, and he did it all with the understanding of, hey, how do I do this? What do I need to change about my deck to be successful in the presumed metagame? And he absolutely killed it. There's actually going to be a cover written by me on the Metafy. If you want to go check that out, it is a public article that's there. You can find it and you can watch it. And a huge shout out to me for writing that for us. All in all, this deck is great. I think it's very well positioned in the metagame. I do think there's a world where we're going to trade out some of these cards for more 4 willpower cards and just kind of go for willpower to combat with some of the steel removal decks. If Sapphire Steel, again, is one of the more played decks, then we have to find a way to answer that correctly. So it really is just going to become a metagame decision of, do I want to be able to beat Sapphire Steel, or do I want to be able to beat Ruby Sapphire? And is there a world where I can try and do both of those things? I believe all that's definitely up for debate right now. Jonathan Williams picked up a 2nd place finish at SSG 138-player tournament, for the 10 cases, and he did it so with Ruby Sapphire items. That's right, this list has Scrooges. We have all of the Tamatoas. We have Maurice's workshops. This is a unconventional tool for a deck for certain. Also, picking up the wonderful bell mechanic. I love this idea. I do love the idea that we were able to create a different version of Ruby Sapphire. It's always possible that when the new set comes out, it's very easy to adapt like most players did and just simply put Sapphire Coil on their deck, kind of up their counts on Sisus, play some human Sisus, and kind of just move through and not really do anything else too creative. Jonathan Williams took the time and really did create a way that in my opinion, probably very much favored him in the mirror match. Having these additional ways to kind of gain lore, the one thing that shocks me more than anything is only one lucky dime. I wonder if that is something that he will change moving forward, or if it's just good enough. We don't need sharks. We don't need actions. We have to win through these items. Maybe we can just do it, and we don't really need dime. We just win through inevitability. All in all, I think that this deck looks great. I think the idea of having Bell Mechanic and Tamatoa is a wonderful way to close out games, and it's definitely doing something quite different than the norm. So huge shout out to Jonathan Williams on this version of this deck, and I'm very curious of how this deck will do kind of moving forward and truly understanding how the play is vastly different than it used to have been for the more traditional versions of this list. I think people saw unconventional tool and said, oh man, I want to put that card in play on turn 1, and I want to play my Bell on turn 1, and then I get my Sapphire Coil, and it sounded really, really cool and really, really interesting, but then they realized they only have 3 cards left in their hand, and that's probably a big deal. So we'll see how this deck kind of just evolves moving forward. Anything changes, ways to make this deck a little bit more consistent, and maybe a little bit more ways to interact with the Sapphire Steel item deck as well. That's right, guys. We started a new podcast on the channel. Going to be looking to do this at least twice a week. We started Tuesday morning. We're going to be looking to do it on Thursday morning as well. And it's just kind of me coming on, bringing on guests from time to time, discussing the happenings of Disney Lorcana, and really just tutoring you to information you might not be aware of outside of just the metagame. That is the whole purpose of this. I had a whole video yesterday basically on if Sapphire Steel items is healthy for the metagame. If you haven't yet, check it out. It's in the description below. Emerald Steel Discard is back with authority, picking up a top 8 at the SSG 138-player tournament. Gaining Pete is a big deal. He is a big, gigantic threat that closes down opponents, prevents them from singing songs, and of course, gives all your pirates resist 1 as well. He is a 5/5 with resist 1 and 2 lore that can sing any song in your deck. This is a really interesting character addition. It's a card that when it was spoiled, I wasn't happy about it. I was very worried about this card making Emerald Steel like a true meta contender again. It is nice to see in week 1 that has already showed to be true. Kylie was able to just crush this weekend. Kylie's been playing Emerald Steel for quite some time. He almost top 8'd the last SSG in February with Emerald Steel. A couple mistakes here and there led him to getting knocked out of the tournament, but he was definitely a contender along the way. The one card I'm most curious about is Lucifer. I'm very much interested in the idea of why Lucifer is seeing play in Emerald Steel right now. It feels like it's mediocre into most of the decks that would carry songs, and it also feels awful to play into the item decks that it can just discard 2 items for free and then play their Tamatoa and get them back instantly. So playing 5 for a 2/2 uninkable that just kind of give my opponent value anyway is something that I think that I would probably be looking to cut in week 2. Just a card I'm not too big of a fan of in general. I wonder what else we can do with that. Noting that we have Benjes in this list is very nice. It's very interesting. It can definitely help you kind of move through the difficult items such as Maurice's Workshop, such as Fishbone Quill, such as Lucky Dime, of course, if our opponents get very fortunate with their Oswald triggers. So I really like the design of this deck. I think that it's going to be a very nice position deck for the metagame. I do think it can play very well in a Ruby Sapphire and Sapphire Steel. Also, it's always been fine into opposing aggro decks in general because of Ursula Deceiver. So I think that this deck is honestly very well positioned in the metagame. It's just going to be a matter of figuring out like probably what the last 10 cards of this deck actually has to be. In this version, we see Mr. Smee that has not really always been common in the past. We still see, 4 Prince Johns, 3 Hypnotize, 4 Sudden Chills. I wonder if that's going to remain true, if we need that much discard for it still to be successful. But all in all, I think that this deck is going to end up being very, very well positioned in the metagame, and it's probably one of the biggest enemies to Sapphire Steel, as it can really keep them low on resources and force them into more RNG situations, along with having the answers to Oswald and things like that. Paul here picked up a top 8 at SSG 138 player tournament as well, with Lady in the Tramp, Amber, Emerald, Aggro. You got to love this stuff week 1. I think it's unique. I think it's very interesting. Including the Tramp as a way to really kind of get an early Chernobog was very interesting. The more funny thing to me was the idea that Chernobog kind of removes the ability of Lady. So because of that, we understand that we're going to play only 2 ladies. Adding the Dale as another way to self-mill to kind of get the Chernobog into play early. I think it's a really interesting concept. I didn't get to see any of this deck on screen yet. I need to go and watch some games. I'm hoping it was over on SHG's stream so I can go back and watch it, because this deck does look a lot of fun. It looks quite different than what we were used to seeing. And I think that it's everything that Lady and the Tramp, goers were hoping for. I also think the budget of this deck is a little higher than I would like to have seen it. Coming in at $250, it's probably mostly the price tag of the Rapunzels, and of course we need Rapunzels. So let's hope that by this time you already have your 4 Rapunzels, because if that is true, the rest of this deck costs less than $50. So, if you're a player that has been around and you have your Rapunzels already, this might be a great budget addition, because, Rapunzels are $50, but the rest of the deck only costs $46. So I think that this is a great little, insert of, hey, I can go and really play the new cards, get my Lady and the Tramp on. The new Yzma is another one. It's really doing a lot of cool and fun things. The 4 willpower is huge, guys. I think it makes Rapunzel.deck very good. So Little John, Nala, and Daisy Duck, of course, all being like 4 willpower characters is huge. The repetitiveness to bring back Lilo against Sapphire Steel is also pretty powerful. It just, they don't have Ruby Sapphire as things where, you need to have Shark. And you're always like, oh man, I can never bring back Lilo because Shark exists. That's not true for the Sapphire Steel matchup. So it gives you a little bit more reach against them as well. All in all, you also have Ward characters here. Prince John is a nice little addition for Ward. Or I'm sorry, Prince Philip is the nice addition for Ward, gaining some 2 lore character that your opponent also can interact with. So all in all, I think this is a really nice fitting deck to the metagame. I'm very curious if it can maintain this position moving forward now that more people have seen it, if more people can pick it up and play it. What will be the success of a deck like this moving forward? Sapphire Amethyst also finds a way into a top 16 at the Southside Game 138 players tournament. When there's a tournament this large and we have the data for top 16, I always like to share it. It also helps when there are different decks that are on the outside looking in. At the end of the day, this deck was 1 win away from being in the top 8, and I'm sure it was very, very close and definitely playing in round 8 for it. So if we were all the way in the bubble match in round 8, playing for top 8, this is a big deal and kind of a good understanding of where this deck's position is. Definitely a few interesting choices in this list. I talked about this early on about Bell, and if Bell was so good in the metagame, and if so many people were going to have to be competing against it, if other Sapphire decks can afford not to. Very interesting to me that this is a deck that goes, I'm just going to play 4 Popsicles, and I'm going to play 4 Bells. I have no idea if this is correct or not correct, but it really is just that theory of showcasing how powerful Bell has and can be. Because you know what? If my turn 1 play is Popsicle, draw a card, blow up the Popsicle with Bell, put my Bell into play, and then turn 2, I get to exert Bell and draw 2 more cards with friends on the other side, that's pretty good. It's not a bad line of play on average, because most likely they're not questing, and then whatever they're questing with, it's going to be a Daisy that you can't remove in one shot. It's going to be cards like Chernobog's Followers or Diablos or Brooms, where they're going to quest with it, pop it, and draw a card anyway, so the Bell's not going to get the value. So the idea that you can sing a card like Friends on the other side, there's also a consideration. I think the uninkable count's probably a little bit high on this one, or it's not worth it, but you could consider playing 1 jump again. So now your Bell can sing 1 jump or sing Friends on the other side. Those are just a couple different options. But, I think it's interesting to see this deck kind of come out and be that. The one card that, of course, shocks me more than anything is Madam Mim Dragon. Madam Mim Dragon is the 7-cost inkable, 5 strength, 7 willpower with evasive, and the ability I win. When you play this character, banish her or return up to 2 chosen characters of yours to your hand. This is a card that we have not seen a whole lot of in Disney Lorcana. It's shown up very, very, I can't remember the last time, guys. It's been so long. So seeing this hit play into a top 16 deck, I'm very curious to how many times it was actually good. If it was just a 60th card, maybe I can get my opponent on some trickery. I don't know. Obviously, this deck has a ton of cards we do want to return to our hand. It does have a way to really, make a wide board. But I'm just so worried that, like, in those games where we don't get to do that, this card is just absolutely blank on average. Very, very tough to tell. I will say again, the library here is a necessity. I think it's a huge deal in which ways that you can answer Ruby Sapphire decks. Kind of just enables you to be the aggressor in the matchup and say, hey, you got to answer all my little donks, or I'm just going to outvalue you and win the game. Or you have to have an answer to my library before that, so I can't continuously draw cards. For a deck that already draws a million cards, it still kind of needs library to maintain the position in the Ruby Sapphire matchup. Again, 1 Elsa, 3 Hades. These are some of the best bombs late in the game, but it does come at that pact of uninkability. So having 4 uninkables in your deck that cost so much, that can easily be stuck in your hand in your opening hand if you don't have Tipo. It's definitely a notable thing. Like, this deck does have a layer of inconsistency that I think other decks do not, just because its endgame threats are uninkable. Ruby Amethyst does make an appearance in the top 8 of the 44-player tournament at Battle Bear. The new additions to this list are the Queen. The Queen is the 4-cost inkable, 4 strength, 3 willpower with 1 lore, and the ability No Ordinary Apple. Exert this character, choose 3 cards from chosen opponent's discard, and put them on the bottom of their deck and gain 3 lore. If a princess card was removed this way, gain 4 lore instead. This is a very interesting way for them to kind of close out the games, interact with opposing item decks, interact with opposing character decks. This does ironically work into the Chernobog deck as well as the self-mill, kind of getting rid of some of those characters, kind of punishing Rapunzels that might hit the discard pile and things like that, gain conditional lore. We've seen versions of this where, we were trying to play LeFou and things like that. Didn't really work out. I think adding a card like Raj, very, very interesting. This is a card that I did not expect to see any play. I certainly do not think that playing Raj over Madame Mim is correct. I think we can make an argument that we could play Raj over Cusco, so we can still have our 4 Madame Mim snakes and then 2 Raj if we just really want 3/3s in play in a way to answer opposing bells. But I do fear that the 3/3 stat line is irrelevant because any of the characters early on just have the ability to exert and sing and remove it, and then the 3/3 stat line was kind of meaningless to begin with, where relying on a 1/3 character that doesn't get banished, that can be hit with a crab, could just be more valuable. So I think that would be a nice lesson to be learned. I'm curious on how that'll work moving forward. Hey, listen, if you think Raj is good and you think you're playing it in Ruby Amethyst decks, hit me up in the comments and let me know. It's a card that I was not expecting to see, if I'm being honest. And of course, the other card I was not expecting to see was Hades. Hades, the Fast Talker, is the 6-cost uninkable, 4 strength, 6 willpower, 2 lore, with the ability for just a little pain. When you play this character, you may deal 2 damage to another chosen character of yours to banish a character with cost 3 or less. This is a very interesting card. It is strictly better than our set championship Scar for sure. I guess I'm really just curious on what this card is actually targeting, or what we don't think we can interact with or answer any better. I do like the idea that we can bring in Hades, kind of remove a 3-cost character from play, and then maybe sing with our 4 or 5, like a card like Be King Undisputed, and having those lines to really manipulate the board and kind of take out bigger characters as well. But it's a lot of uninkable count, right? This deck here itself is 14 uninkables, which feels a little high on average for Ruby Amethyst decks to their consistent levels. When you're talking that they're having 5, 8 uninkables of 6 or more in the deck, definitely a problematic thing to consider. But yeah, I think this deck is interesting. I'm curious on how Ruby Amethyst, being as fair as it is, how it's going to maintain position. But when you look at this list and we're talking about budgets, $124 on this deck list is really, really cheap. So if you're still on the budget end and you're still looking to kind of like contend within that $100 to $150 range, then I do think that this is a good option for you. Amethyst Steel mid-range. I think that this is an interesting question about the deck in general. And I think it comes down to like, hey, what is mid-range and what is aggro for these dock decks? You know, this deck itself is not many cards different than the deck earlier, but the deck earlier is labeled as aggro, and this deck is labeled as mid-range. I think it has to do with the potential converted mana cost option, and maybe this deck has just 8 4 costs, and the other deck might have had 6 or 7. So I think that that's very interesting on how we're gonna like really classify this. I personally think that even though this list was labeled as a mid-range, that it's still actually just aggro. So as we break it down here for Jake, shout out to Jake. He's a friend of TFM. Him and Dick Burns go way back. Shout out to Team Rebirth as well for their top 8 finish this weekend. So top 8 SSG, 138 players here. Jack, this is it, right? This I think is another version of saying, hey, all I need to do in week 1 is put Cobras into my deck and kind of move forward. We do choose to play the friends on the other side rather than and then along came Zeus, and I think that's just an inkability choice. I think we're just saying like, hey, I'm gonna know that my Strength of Raging Fires have to answer Sharks because it's my only out, but only having the 4 Strength of Raging Fires is maybe a problem. It's definitely something we have to consider moving forward if we have to feel like there's too many characters that when they're in play we must answer. So that is definitely a choice that we're going to have to make moving forward. But all in all, I think, again, this deck is very well positioned. I think if you already owned the majority of this deck going into this weekend, then you didn't have any trouble picking up your Cobras. So I think everything about this list is really, really great for week 1. Huge shout out again to Jake for picking up the top 8 this past weekend. 11 different decks this weekend. A great start to the Disney Lorcana metagame, in my humble opinion. I don't think we could have asked for much more out of it. I think it's very nice that we were able to start the weekend strong. I think it's a little scary that we might have had the same deck dominated 2 tournaments, really only losing to itself pretty much, but still showing some kinks in the armor along the way of giving people a real way to kind of attack this deck, understanding that, 4 willpower is good, understanding that aggression is good. The deck does not certainly does not win fast, and if you're able to disrupt its engines enough, depending on like what is the most important engine in a given turn or a given game, it could really lead to some disruption for the deck. But at the end of the day, I'm still very, very fearful of the idea that this deck is just good, and this deck just does a lot of very unfair things in a field of decks that are just mostly fair. So I am curious on where you are standing so far in the metagame. Do you like it? Do you dislike it? How's Archazias Island doing? Let me know in the comments below where you're at, as I'm still kind of developing this answer for myself. There are certainly things I do like. There are certainly things that I'm quite worried about. I discussed all of this on the podcast yesterday about Sapphire Steel and really what it could do for new player experience and how it can be non-interactive. And I just fear for the game moving towards a bunch of non-interactive decks. So let me know where you guys are at. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Hit me up with it. If you haven't yet, make sure you hit the thumbs up on this button or thumbs down, whatever you're into. That's fine by me too. If you enjoy this type of video, you have to know that we do this weekly. Whenever there are tournaments to be discussed, we go in, we find them, we get the stats, we come back, we give you the best way to kind of move forward in your metagame, kind of understanding what other players might be bringing to the table. Thank you guys so much for watching today. We'll catch you in the next video.